Could technology save democracy from itself? Let's welcome Jonathan Sotsky from Knight Foundation, Tiana Epps-Johnson of Center for Technology and Civic Life, and Meghan Nesbit of Twilio to the stage.
All right. That was very calm applause, if you don't mind. Thank you. That was much better. My name's Meghan Nesbit. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Market Development at Twilio.org. We have Jonathan from the Knight Foundation, Director of Strategy and Assessment. And we have Tiana from the Center for Technology and Civic Life. Thank you for being here and talking about civic tech. So the 2016 election, I think we all saw a huge explosion in interest and energy around a lot of people building a lot of different tools and innovations around civic tech. The trick is how do you scale those and how do you take those into long-term sustainability? So we're going to dive into what's working, what isn't working, and what the future for civic tech looks like. So to start, Tiana, how is it that you ended up on a stage in San Francisco talking about civic tech?
So I promised Meghan that I wasn't going to go all the way back to when I was 6 years old, but I am going to go back to 2006. I was an intern in DC at the Lawyers Committee and their Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and their Voting Rights Project, and they run this awesome hotline that anyone can call in if they have any sort of voting-related incidents that they experience. And I was helping to field some of those calls, and I was really prepared for the ones that are about misinformation or deceptive practices. But what I was struck by, and I wasn't prepared for, were the number of calls that were coming in from folks across the country with really basic questions about how the voting and elections process worked. Things like, how do I get registered? Where do I go to vote? And I was also really struck by how hard it was to find those answers to connect people with that information so that they could go cast a ballot. So fast forward to 2010, I was then in DC and I joined a data and technology team that was part of the first effort to create a national free data set of polling place information online in partnership with Google and the Pew Charitable Trusts. And sort of caught that bug, and for the better part of the last decade have been working to think about the ways that we can use technology to better connect people with voting information, and also how we can equip people in local government with the resources that they need to be able to better administer elections. And so in 2014, sort of spun my team off from this nonprofit that I was working at before into its own organization. And today, since doing that work, we've trained thousands of local election officials on how to use technology to better engage the folks in their communities. And we also have aggregated big data sets with answers to questions like what's on my ballot that in 2016 were accessed by between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone who cast a ballot.
Great. John.
Hi, everyone. So I'm John Sotsky at the Knight Foundation, and Knight works to support more informed and engaged communities. And its legacy is that the Knight brothers used to own newspapers. They were the largest newspaper company in the country. Thankfully sold that before newspaper valuations went down the toilet, started a foundation, and we support largely journalism and civic engagement. So the reason I'm here most directly is because civic tech has been a focus of Knight, and we've done a lot of research in the space, including a report we put out last year called Scaling Civic Tech, which really was designed to learn more about the challenges that startups, both for-profits and nonprofits, in the civic tech arena face towards scaling and developing business models that can help them grow and sustain their operations. So I really hope you all have a chance to check out the report afterwards, but I'm looking forward to digging into the findings.
Great. If you haven't read the report, I highly recommend it. Incredible insights. I'm up here, honestly, because about 20 years ago, I was living in a van, and I broke down a mile and a half away. Honestly, it was 1998, and there was an incredible internet boom happening in the Bay Area. And I was so excited by the potential of the technology, but also by the social awareness and social intention and civic engagement in the Bay Area. And I wanted to be a part of both of those things. So I've kind of jumped around from nonprofit, and I was over at Salesforce Foundation in the early days, change.org for some time, and now with Twilio. So I've also been able to see some pretty exciting changes in civic tech over the time. But let's start with what you're seeing that is most exciting in the civic tech space.
Yeah.
Tiana, what's popping for you?
Yeah. Sort of thinking big picture, one of the things that I have been really excited to see is the number of organizations who are really centering the folks that they are hoping to serve and their approach to how they're building technology. And so a couple of concrete examples of organizations that I wish that I worked for if I wasn't working for my own. One of them is called MRelief, and they're based in Chicago, and saw that billions of dollars in food stamp aid goes unclaimed every year, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that the application process to see if you qualify for these benefits is really cumbersome. It's dozens of pages long and requires a ton of documentation. And MRelief has been able to develop a screening tool that uses text messaging and that allows folks to be able to do that screening process in 5 minutes or less, and then provide support to figure out how you can then provide the documentation that you need to actually complete an application. And they've been able to reach over nearly 250,000 people and connect them with the benefits they need. So that's one clear example. Another is an organization that we partner with often called the Center for Civic Design. Their slogan is that democracy is a design problem. And they do amazing research and usability testing and design work to think about the ways that we might apply design practices to tools and materials to make sure that voters of all different types of information needs and accessibility are able to actually cast meaningful ballots and participate in the process.
Yeah, I love those examples. I think MRelief is an organization I've gotten to know through Twilio, and the thing I love about what they did was using technology to increase access, right? Solving the under-enrollment problem and something like supplemental nutrition assistance program through technology built for the person that needs it. I think that's a super exciting trend we're seeing. What about from the funding side?
Yeah, when you work in evaluation and research in the world of philanthropy at a foundation, you're often so starved for good data. You're always looking for good data. But I mean, as the last two speakers have shown, looking at even beyond 12, looking at Crisis Text Line and how they've put data at the center of their work, I think it's really promising. It's something that's emerging in this new crop of organizations. I think 5 years ago, there was no such title as Chief Data Officer or Chief Data Scientist at a nonprofit. And while it's still not a common one, it's one that's certainly growing. And I think coming out of the 2016 election, look, for better or for worse, it's fueled a strong interest in the civic realm amongst so many funders and high net worth donors. We have, I can tell you, it was a lonely pool to swim in as a foundation that talked about civic engagement and informed society in like 2015. All of a sudden, every other funder is incorporating civic engagement as an element into their strategy. That, coupled with just a lot of donors who come to this space or want to give towards improving our democracy, is a big macro trend that we can capitalize on. And I think, frankly, it seemed like in January 2017, there was a lot of $1 million donations announced to the ACLU, and I think that's partly a reflection of people's intentions to want to give, but not necessarily knowing who to give to. So like, okay, well, the ACLU, they do good work, let's give it to them. But I think there's so many more organizations that are sprouting up in this space that could really be the beneficiaries of an influx in dollars.
That's great. So on the good side of things, we have, I think for building new technologies for civic tech and engagement, we have things we can do with data we didn't even have before, right? The ability to collect massive amounts of data, to analyze it. We have new trends happening on the funding side of things. So there are some things going well, and there are some things that don't seem to be carrying on for scale and long term. So where do you think some of the gaps are? What are we not getting right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most amazing things to see is all of this new energy that you mentioned of folks wanting to build cool tools to help with civic engagement. But it is also a relatively new space, and there is not a lot of building and sharing of institutional knowledge of what's worked and what hasn't. And that means that we see a lot of reinvention of the wheel, and we see tools that are developed that ultimately fail because we're not incorporating learnings that, that we could be. So to give a concrete example from sort of my work, I have been pitched dozens of times about a one-stop shop for civic engagement, a native app that someone could download and find all the information that they needed. And there's been lots of these tools that folks have tried to develop, sort of like, just this one-stop shop. And what we've seen is that, nearly every time there are a few really core challenges with doing that. One, user acquisition is super difficult. And if you are designing a native app, that means that the folks that are going to take the effort to go to the App Store and download the thing that you developed, they're probably already the folks that are super engaged, and so you're probably not meeting your audience. Also often, these apps don't have the data that they need to actually scale. And so if folks are looking to build something that's a 50-state tool, it requires lots and lots of data that lives in lots of disparate places, and we often see grand plans for making that happen, but often the resulting product being something that sort of only works at the federal level. And also, there's often way too much functionality. It's trying to do too many things, not really a clear user in mind. And this happens time and time again. There's lots of folks in this space, like myself, that would be happy to share sort of these lessons learned, but there's not any great practices that exist so far on how to capture these case studies and share them so that we're learning from one another and building the best tools possible. So if I were giving advice to other entrepreneurs, it'd be one, to have a really clear theory of change about how the tool that you're building is really going to have the impact on the audience that you're targeting to help. And also to just do a really thorough landscape analysis and learn from folks who have tried similar things before to see how you can use those learnings to build something better that works.
Yeah, I focus on a couple of different challenges right now. One is certainly the learning challenge that Tiana's pointed out. It feels like the for-profit startup space has a tech crunch that, if a $1.2 million seed round occurs for an on-demand flip-flop company, like there's an article written about it, and when they get acqui-hired, there's another article about that. There's nothing covering the nonprofit startup space regularly disseminating learnings, and I think it's a huge need. So +1 on that. A second thing I would point out, and Nancy alluded to this in her comments earlier, is startup nonprofit tech organizations are like tech companies, but foundations continue to support them like they're any other type of nonprofit. So they don't necessarily have the skills, the insights, or the experiences to understand what it takes to build and scale an effective tech organization. And I think that has hampered the way that they've funded them and not really providing enough what I'd call build capital. This is investment in core capacities, including impact measurement, communications, tech development, sales, which is sometimes even a dirty word in the nonprofit space, cultivation of small donors, things like that, versus just specific funding for implementing projects. And I can go on and on about the challenges, but I think we want to be more optimistic in the session. But I just think overall, we're challenged with learning. We're challenged with the types of dollars that are entering the field, and ultimately challenged to identify business models. And that's one thing that the report covers in great length is figuring out what will be the source of income when a grant from a corporate foundation or a private foundation suspends. And we've seen some development of new revenue streams beyond SaaS models, a lot of consulting services, which I think are promising given the credibility of nonprofit organizations to consult on top of data services that they're providing or software services. And we've seen some interesting small donor-based cultivation efforts that have gone on, especially in media following the election, but ultimately still not enough diversified or earned revenue streams being developed by organizations in the space.
And the reason that's so important, I'm assuming, is because you want to have the visibility into the long-term sustainability of the project versus just getting to the first proof of concept product or beyond.
Right.
Yeah. So Tiana, one thing you touched on that I think is fascinating is like how we share failures, right? So there's probably an entire app graveyard out there, right, of things that did not work. Like 8 people downloaded it. Can you think of a way where we could, what is the best way for us to share failure so we're not repeating the same mistakes every time? Or maybe there already is a place for that to happen.
Yeah, one thing that we do in our own work is around the question of making sure that we're connecting the public with information about what's on their ballot. We convene about 40 organizations that range from the federal government down to local, state-based groups who try to solve for that challenge, and we all come together once a year, and we talk about what's going well, what are areas where we can collaborate better, and what are really specific challenges that we can work on together as a field. And the first time that we had one of those convenings, it was really the core thing that we're trying to do was just build trust, because it's really hard to talk about failures if you are in an environment with people who are basically your competitors, to then share what's not working well. But we were able to do that and then sort of create a community that was open to not only talking about what was not going well, but ways that we could move forward. And so we sort of launched into really concrete working groups in a few issue areas and have continued those over the last 2 years and have seen real improvements there. And it has created this environment where we all feel more comfortable not only talking about what is going well, but what isn't.
That's great. Anything you want to add there?
I'd say it's the responsibility of funders also to ask the question when someone comes in, they say, what have you learned from any organization that's worked in this, or how are you the same or different from any other organization? And if a company says, or an organization says, we're totally different than anything that comes before us, to not fund them, because there's just so much overlap that we see in the space, whether you're a slice of open data sharing, government to resident collaboration, building a tech tool that aids social service delivery. There's something that's been done before that's relevant, and I think we discount that far too much and the learnings from those projects far too much when building our new thing, because there's glory and there's a lot of pride in authorship, I think, in creating the next new tool versus the iteration upon something that's been done, but improving it based on why it didn't work.
Do you think we've got the right balance between collaboration, cooperation, and consolidation in the sector? You may see this as differently. I feel like every day there's a new organization sprouting up because they started again and another new thing. Do you think in the sector we're seeing the right level of consolidation or cooperation?
I think there's a lot more consolidation that's needed in the nonprofit sector. I think I'm not sure I held that view so firmly in the civic tech space. I think I do still, but in nonprofit, everyone has the right to start a nonprofit, and they can exist in perpetuity. It's a tax status, and as long as you can raise money for it, it just completely undermines economies of scale. And whereas companies will go out of business if they just don't make money. So I think that's led to a lot of zombie nonprofits out there, and there would be a lot more impact, I think, by consolidating resources. And I think that's probably true in civic tech too, that there's, it's still a newer space, but there's a lot of organizations that are a different flavor of ice cream, but they're ice cream at the end of the day. And we should think about, rather than spreading a lot of bets, especially in a field I think that requires, and we've talked about before, it doesn't have network effects to the extent that other for-profit industries does. We're undermining those network effects and certain revenue streams, including advertising, including SaaS models, because the cost of customer acquisition is so high. We're undermining that by, I think, spreading our bets too thin. So I would argue that there is some consolidation that's needed.
And you started your own organization, Tiana.
I wouldn't push back too firmly on the idea that there could be some good that would come out of consolidation, but I would say that from my perspective as someone who does fundraising, that there's not a lot of incentive for us to do that consolidation, because we find that the size of grant making that comes from foundations is still pretty small for folks doing work like ours. And in fact, we're able to raise more money by working in partnership with other organizations who are also independently raising money to do work together than we would be able to if we consolidated as one organization and were asking for even some of the largest checks that foundations are writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a different perspective from the side of the coin, whether you're raising the funds or you're distributing the funds and what you want out of it. Okay, so what are you most hopeful for as you look down the path ahead? What should we be most hopeful for in civic tech?
I would sort of echo my first answer to this question, which is I'm really hopeful about the extent to which organizations are increasingly doing co-creation of tools with the folks that they're serving. I think that there's a really excellent body of work by a person named Lauren Ellen McCann, who has really advocated for this idea of building with, not for. I recommend folks seek out what they've had to say on that. But for us, what that looks like in our work, when we are building something like this election toolkit that we built with election officials, the process for that included first doing a workshop with folks in local government who are ultimately going to be the user of this tool to define what they thought the problem was and what solutions might look like for that. Then we brought them together in a workshop to design what the site itself would look like. Then we did months of usability testing, both on the structure itself and the content. That takes a lot longer than some development cycles, but it also was the most confident I've ever been in a launch. I was actually on a plane to New Orleans when it launched because I knew at that point that not only was it going to be a successful product because we were solving for real-world challenges, but we also had folks that were so invested in the creation process that they then were built-in users and evangelists for the work and sort of shared that with their networks, which allowed us to sort of scale the reach of those tools.
I love how the process enables you to actually have the internal evangelists as you're going.
Yeah.
I can imagine that accelerates impact.
It really does.
What about you? What are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful, and it's really based on even, and you see it here today, is that there's been an influx in skilled volunteerism into the space that makes me really hopeful. I think that what we see when talking to a lot of startups in the space is how the founding team usually either has technical competency or they're coming from government or a civic engagement background, but not both, and generally they don't have any experience on or often don't have any experience on business planning and other core functions. So I think the influx of talent is going to be really valuable for startups in this field and utilizing those skills and experiences to help them grow and ultimately grow business models. I can't tell you, like probably 3 or 4 times, even in the last few months, where asking a nonprofit, what's your long-term sustainability strategy? And the answer was a version of, I just got to find my billionaire. Like, it was like, that was the phrase used, like, find billionaire, step A, step B, sustainable. So
that's my marriage strategy.
That's really a roulette sustainability strategy that I can't endorse as somebody promoting more sustainable models in the field. Certainly it's happened. I think there have been more billionaires that are giving money and large checks to nonprofits, especially with a tech orientation, but certainly hopeful for that we'll develop and continue to pioneer different revenue streams that will allow more organizations that don't happen to find their billionaire to grow.
That's great. Do you guys think you could do a really quick piece of advice if you were to give advice to a funder on what you would want them to?
So Jonathan mentioned investing in core capacity, and I sort of want to take that one step further. If I were giving advice to funders, I would recommend not only funding organizations for sort of the program impact that they're going to have, but also providing capacity funding so that organizations are building out actual organizations so that we're able to focus on aligning our staff around values, so that we're able to focus on retaining good talent and hiring good talent, so that we're able to think about how we recruit and sustain a board of directors that's going to help us move forward. These are all things that, especially as a lot of us who are founders that come from the experience of the work and not necessarily running organizations, don't have a ton of expertise on, and it takes time and it takes money to do those things right. And there are far too few funders that are willing to write checks for that. So for the funders in the room, there's a great report written by the Youth Engagement fund about how to support young leaders of organizations that give some really practical advice that I think is excellent, specifically around building out capacity building funds for the work.
Yeah, I would say come to a foundation really with a market fit and clear definition of who the audience is, and not just a broad statement of need. I call this kind of the fallacy of pent-up demand in the civic engagement space. The storyline something along the lines usually of, people really want to get civically engaged, they just don't know how to do it. If only there was a tool that would help people get engaged. You know, over and over again, we've seen those organizations and tech products just end up being like a burnt-out car on the side of the road, frankly. The road is littered with these concepts. I really want to hear from folks. Who are they trying to serve? What have they learned from organizations that have preceded them? And when Knight's grant or a funder's grant concludes in the next year, what's going to be their strategy for ultimately finding different revenue streams? Not asking at all, be 100% sustainable earned revenue, not at all. I just want to know what the plan for ultimately growing a more varied set of funding sources will be over time, not just the plan for building the thing.
Excellent pieces of advice for both funders and nonprofits alike in the room. I think we've got time for one question, if anybody from the audience has a question. I could see one person in the back there. Sir, you?
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. One question that came to mind, maybe it's a little academic, but how do you think about the end or the objective of civic engagement? I mean, I think people sort of see it as an unvarnished good, but I think the academic literature is maybe a little bit more nuanced about what civic engagement actually does. I think more representation tends to skew towards the left, which some people see as really good, but I think civic engagement is often perceived as sort of this nonpartisan good. So I'm curious how you think about that and how that influences your grant making and your work.
For us, so some people we work in media and then support civic engagement. So most people who support media are doing it as a means to an end. Sometimes it's civic engagement too, and New Crop of Funders is a means to an end. We want to engage people to advance this outcome, or we want to inform them to advance this outcome. Knight's one of the rare exceptions where it's more about the ends and really a belief in core components of what comprises a representative democracy. So for us, that really is the component. And I think what we look at declining levels of institutional trust, and that's across media institutions, across democratic institutions, frankly across almost all institutions, minus the military, and nonprofits have been somewhat removed from societal trends. We look at civic engagement as an approach that it's also about restoring faith in our governance and citizens feeling like they have ultimately a voice in decision-making that occurs as a country.
Yeah, and for us, when we think about our work on modernizing civic engagement, what we're trying to achieve in the world is both more inclusive and more engaged folks, and that ultimately leads to more reflective leadership. And we have folks on our board that are Republicans and Democrats and everything in between, but we also recognize that unfortunately it's inherently progressive thing to want a system that works for everybody, and we're okay with that.
That is great, thank you. From my perspective, the part about civic engagement and civic tech that's most important is that it's for everybody, it's for all, it's how we participate, trust in our government and our communities. And I thank you guys very much for being leaders in the field. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be here later if you'd like to talk to these guys after.